Firstly, it's an honor to be here. I've been fortunate enough to be at Klosters Forum for a few times, and I'm. I think what made it special for me the first time I came was I remember I told Stephanie this actually that I think it was your grandmother or actually just came to give me cake, and I was sitting there and she was handing out the cake, and I was like, wow, the care, and I was just like, and the cake was amazing, and just the love of that small event, that the care that was being given to every one of us as we stood in real relationship was just extraordinary. And that made a different type of conversation. So I just remember that experience and feeling. For that, I always owed a deep gratitude for why I'm here. Um, I want to, the talk I'm going to give is not a kind of my typical indie talk. I actually sat down and thought quite hard as to why I think this Klosters Forum is really important. I don't claim to be an artist and I don't claim to be a cultural speaker, so I'm going to talk about the question of being human as where the crisis of culture and environmentalism, I think, is rooted. And it's rooted in a fundamental question of how we imagine ourselves. And that's the kind of hypothesis I want to put forward to you. And I want to go through that conversation over this period as a kind of provocation. It's still an emerging conversation for me. I think there's doubts and assumptions in there for me, but I think there is something there that is calling me in it. And also, I want to recognize where I am. In the last 10 years, was building dark matter labs. And September last year, I basically agreed that I wanted to build something inside dark matter labs. And for the first time now, I'm building basically a capital pool focusing on existential crises which are fundamental, I think, to the survival of our civilization. And how do you finance those models? And I think the future of being human is that sort of crisis. I think it's that fundamental. And it's in this context that I want to open up this conversation. And the human question, I think, is a function of the polycrisis, which is often talked about, I think is all rooted in the imagination of self. And an imagination of self that was born, certainly from a Western perspective, maybe about 400 years ago. And that imagination of self is manifesting in the crisis. My hypothesis to you. And they are born of 6 reductions of what it means to be human that have allowed certainly exceptional things to happen and also horrific things to happen. These 6 reductions, I would argue, the first one is the objectification of being human as an object. And in the act of basically objectifying the world and distancing ourselves from the world in the process, and perspective, all these tools of separation, we allowed ourselves the permission of violence. In the act of objectification, we created the separation and the space for dominion, control, and violence, and other forms of manipulation, right? Industrial manipulation. But this was a fundamental tool. In this is also the labor bargain, the bargain of labor. When you create a world of objectification, separation, you also create the world of instruction, control, and the theory of labor, the reduction of being human to a unit of activity which can be pre-coded by somebody else and released. And why I want to build on that is also the theory of self. So often, if you listen to people like Tristan Harris, they'll talk to you about the game theory problem. That the reason why we can't solve any of the problems that we have is there's a game theory problem of how we organize. So if you put people around a room, they'll always optimize for themselves, and thereby the commons will always get depleted. Alan Alstrom, all these people, many people have coded about that. The statement I want to play to you is that the problem is not the game, the problem is ourselves. The problem isn't the game just manifests the logics that we've rooted in ourselves. So if we've rooted ourselves to be finite, momentary, we optimize for the moment and for the definitiveness of us in this moment of being. So the game is reflecting ourselves. And the crisis, I would argue, is that we've made ourselves hyper-present, hyper-individuated, and hyper-separated. And in that act, the game theory problem is the theory problem that we're living in as a result. To change the game is to change ourselves. And the science of all this stuff is already here, by the way. And that's why the game becomes small and externalizing. So we optimize to the now, we make finite games, and we externalize costs and liabilities into the world. The problem right now is all those liabilities are coming back to us. They're recoupling us and re-entangling us in ways that haven't been historically acknowledged. The next crisis of self is the certainty machine, the theory of certainty. We operate in logics of certainty. And actually, and I'll talk more about this later, I think one of the most profound things that informationally is true is that none of us can know everything. It is informationally impossible for you to know everything. And thereby, you have to exist in doubt. The existence in doubt is close to describing reality as any word can be. And if that's true, then that demands a different way of being. It demands curiosity, because my horizon of knowing and your horizon of knowing will be different. I will have to be curious to know more. It demands tentativeness, tenderness, and care as a way of being to deal with not knowing. So the certainty machine has created the illusion of knowing and given us the illusion of certainty in action, and removed doubt, tenderness, and care, the epistemic ways of being, from our vocabulary of how we organize ourselves. And then the next part is the theory of human assemblage. You will have been told you have a memory, you compute, you think, you're intelligent, and often we think of these things as separate things. We have a memory, we have compute, but we don't. That's not how the neuroscience of our brain works. Our memory and compute is bounded together. They're bounded functions. The imagination of them being separated is actually that of the machine. Our beauty is that we are bounded functions. Memory and compute aren't separated. If I ask you to think of your existence right now, can you feel your brain separated? And this binding function is really important. And in lots of the consciousness conversations, the fact that we have a binding is consciousness, is the fact that the lack of separation is consciousness. Yet all of our language operates in the world of the assemblage of humans. Components assembled together with marvelous capabilities. And perhaps it's the other way around. The binding is the marvelous thing. Now, I'm intentionally taking us down a philosophical route because I think the coding of the problem isn't just air source heat pumps, which is why I'm kind of glad we are in this conversation now. We did the conversation of materials and biomaterials last year and the year before. But actually the epistemic problem is this. It's much more deeply rooted in our theory of ourselves, and thereby the culture and our operating norms and our perceptions of the world around us. And then the context in which all this sits in is really important. And more, I would say that we're operating in a context, a psychogeography of fear. And the fair is a constructed psychogeography. If you make people precarious, if you make people vulnerable, you create if you change people, aging population, demographics, all these factors, and even how we construct attention. If you construct attention through a theory of fair, you are creating the psychogeography of fair. Psychogeography is no longer just an implied reality, a cultural idea. It's a machinable problem, unfortunately. And I think it's being machined. We are machining a psychogeography rooted in fear because it allows people to be instrumentalized easier and instrumentalized in ways that I think due to their fear. So if we talk about these fundamentals, I think hopefully as cultural practitioners and leaders, far greater than I am, I hope what we can start to do over the next few days is start to talk about actually some of these fundamentals and how they manifest in reimagining, I think, what we need. My call is we need to reimagine Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man has to be reimagined. Vitruvian Man was perfect for the moment it was done, but our conception of what it means to be human is fundamentally outdated. And we don't have the cultural representation and the cultural discourse to be able to break free from it. We're still living in a cultural discourse largely of industrialized creativity and industrialized culture. What does it mean to rewild that option up? So the consequences, I would argue, is that these situations are quite dire. These different factors that I've spoken about are coupling together in lots of different ways. Increasingly, and one of the perhaps most profound for me is we are perhaps 2028-ish, we will hit a major labor crisis. I would anticipate it's going to come much quicker. The collapse of actually the value of being human to the economy. And once the economy starts to expunge the theory of labor from itself, the value of being human and recognition, I think, is going to be in deep crisis as we've coded our theory of meaning through our persistence through labor. What happens then? And I think you're already seeing the precursors of that in many ways. And the precursors are culturally, what we do is we other, inside and outside. And we create the permissions of war and conflict. And those cultural codes are being written already. What we're also seeing in that process is a compression of what the language I use is optionality, like the future possibles are compressing. And our ability and our imagination of the future possibles is also being compressed through whether it's the psychogeography of fear to other dimensions, we are seeing the future possibles compress. And that then increasingly we operate in zero-sum game futures. My future versus your future. If you have a future, I can take something away. So expanding the future is actually critical to actually creating a space for us to manifest our dreams. And what we're seeing is a collapse of the compression of that optionality. This is what I meant by the economic, so expelled from the economic meaning. All of this and the social contract becomes more fragile, more vulnerable. More and more of the models that we're doing, what we're worried about is not necessarily biophysical AMOC current collapsing in 2100. What we're worried about is the volatility that's happening already in our weather systems and how that volatility drives inequality, runaway inequality, and how that runaway inequality makes the social contract fragile. And that cascade, I think we're at the beginning of in many, many ways. And in those moments, I think our friend, the state and corporates tend towards certain behaviors. In moments of degenerative volatility, the state and corporates tend to either move towards authoritarianism or extractionism. And this isn't a personality problem. This is a problem of volatility. As volatility increases, states are requested more control and certainty. They respond by trying to provide control and certainty. through authoritarian mechanisms. It's a function of a system which is trying to resolve volatility. Extractionism increases as the thermodynamics of the system decline. These aren't predictions like a magician. You can see it as a thermodynamic problem. As the thermodynamics of our societies decline, which it is, fundamentally, 1920s, 1 barrel of oil gave, 1 barrel of oil's use of energy gave you 120 barrels of oil of energy. Now 1 barrel of oil gives you only 7. So we've got a net reduction of energy invested to energy returned in civilization. It's gone from 120 to 7. That means it's costing us more and more energy to extract energy from the system. And that's like, and if it gets to 4, we're in trouble, basically. So these things set the preconditions of authoritarianism, control, extractionism, or breakdown. And the question for me is, what is the middle space? What is a space which allows for multiple sovereignties to coexist, but not through representation, not through pseudo mechanisms of control, but new means of many-to-many participation, many-to-many agreements, many-to-many cohabitation? How do we expand the sovereignty of living and consciousness whilst allowing complexity to be dealt with in a different way? That, I think, has to be the goal if we believe in the expansion of sovereignty and agency in a complex world. And typically in these scenarios, when authoritarianism, you create the enemy within, and then you create the enemy outside. It's nothing fresh, nothing new. It's not even, I wouldn't even say there's some dark evil person at the back end of it. It's just a function of a system working to preserve the social contract. Just the function of a system working to preserve the social contract in their perceived sense. Enemy within, then enemy without, and then you are in a pathway of mutually assured social destruction. And I think we're remarkably close. Much closer than people say, largely because the cost of war is nearly zero now. Cost of large-scale violence is virtually zero. I know one location in the world where somebody turned up to a ministry with a pathogen saying it would destroy a large amount of people, and the ministry went, how did this happen? So the cost of war is virtually zero. Traumas that were undealt with, unregistered, unmanaged are bubbling up. Power is no longer asymmetric, and we're living in this period. So that was the dark bit. Bring it back up. Okay. No, but that's my role, right? I'm going to take you to darkness. You got 2 days of light. And actually, you're going to have lots of fun just soon after me as well. So it'll be all right. But I think the reason why I want to be here, right, is that I think it's really important for us to actually look the problem in the eyes. My biggest worry has been over the last 10 years is too many people are not looking the problem in the eyes and looking slightly left and squinting it and going, well, it's a nice tree. I planted it. It's going to be all right. It's not going to be all right. If you're going to be actually transform what needs to be transformed, we are going to have to look the problem square in the eyes and look through it to something incredible. And that's the other part of the story, that I think when you look through this problem, something incredible is available. And there is no return to the old in this, unfortunately. There is no pathway in certainly the analysis that we've done. People talk about we can return to some, England will close up its borders and it'll be fine. No, it won't. Right? Because it'll be fine in the sense it doesn't have glasses, it doesn't have microphones, it doesn't have phones, it doesn't have genes, can't even probably build a toaster, right? Most places in the world can't even build a toaster because a toaster relies on global supply chains, let alone our clothes. So if we're willing to accept whether it's, I think all of Europe was not producing any paracetamol in COVID. not paracetamol, was being produced in Europe. So when we talk about this future, we have to start to realize how systemically entangled we are. So this demands a new response. And the first proposition I want to say is I think it demands an investment in being human, an extraordinary investment. Perhaps even, I would say, if I was advising AI funds, a lot of people want to put money into AI, I would be saying at least 20% of your money should be going into the future of being human. Because there is no future of AI if we end up in fundamentals mutually assured destruction. And unless we can resolve a thesis of being human, which I think is, by the way, extraordinary, there is no real future in AI. The two are co-joined. In fact, with one of the major frontier labs, we're exactly having this conversation. There's no viable future of imagining AI without reimagining what it means to be human. These are co-joined in innovations. And I think there's some open questions. Here I am weak and you guys are going to be better. But I think there's a really interesting question about rebuilding the free mind. So in a psychogeography of fear, when the great attractor is fear and reacting to fear, building people's capacity to recognize that great attractor of fear, to be able to actually resist it, to keep space for optionality is a type of development and free mind that's really valuable right now. Really valuable. How do we build that? And I don't think it's all the usual tricks. I don't think it's going to be like truth telling with X, having more truth finders. I don't think it's any of that stuff. I think it's actually about building capabilities in being human. I think it's also biological, right? So the reality is the human brain is almost certainly a quantum classical machine. That's where the science certainly is. It's not a compute. If you speak to people like Forrest Landry, they'll say, what makes human consciousness interesting is humans have an embodied consciousness, a beingness, but they also have a mirror consciousness. I can see myself through others. And he would argue there's a universal consciousness as well. And at the intersection of that is what it means to be human. And so I think when you look at even the biology, it gets very interesting. And the ecology of constructing the free mind. How do you build a constitutional ecology for constructing the free mind? I think is the great project of the age. What does that mean? How do you create the conditions for that? How do you create the capacity for that? And this goes back to one of the things I said right at the beginning. For me, what became really interesting was this whole idea of doubt. Because it was literally this stack. I cannot know everything, neither can any of you. So if I cannot know everything, everything I must say must exist in a realm of doubt. And if doubt is persistent as a reality, then what I must operate within is a degree of curiosity, tentativeness, tenderness as how I manifest in the world and care. Now, the beautiful part isn't just what it means to be human, is what happens if you take that onto the idea of machines. Machines as doubtful things. Machines as tentative things. Machines as relationships of care. And what does that do to the human-machine relationship when that's the theory of agency? Not goal-driven systems. And goal-driven systems always fail because they generate externalities. Goal-driven, you're not a goal-driven machine. This is like a bad ontology of the world. Right? So we're borrowing bad ideas. So what happens when this sort of way of thinking opens up the paradigm of how we see the world around us? And again, here's another one I don't know how to deal with. But I think there's something profound in moving from the economy of labor to the economy of consciousnesses. I don't know what it means yet. But I do know that in the bindings conversation of consciousnesses, there's something important about actually existing in the bindingness of it. And what does that drive? What is the expansion of our theory of labor in that consciousness? I think is really important. And this also opens up the point I said right at the beginning, our theory of self. Are we operating in a theory of self which is finite, or are we operating in our theory of self of infinite? Right now, I think in California, many of the conversations, certainly I've been part of, is pathways of the of infinite living, whether it's through AI or whether it's through biological parts replacement, or whether it's through other forms of sort of having more children. Like these are all different pathways of access to infinity. Right? And there's others. And the question then becomes, how do you deal with finiteness and infiniteness simultaneously? The question is not an either-or question. It's an and question. And often we live in either-or. Often our arguments are either-or, finite, infinite. But our ability to live in finite infiniteness simultaneously, actually, that horizon is really important. So how do we operate in that reality, I think becomes really, really vital. And in that vitality, the game theory problem changes. So there's a developmental question of what it means to be human, to be able to live in the finite and the infinite in order to change the game theory problem of social organizing. And that changes our capacity to do mass, large-scale, multi-agent organizing in a way that we've never imagined before. So the core proposition for me to you here is that the crisis of environmentalism in culture is rooted in the reimagination of the being human. And by being human, I mean recognizing ourselves as biologically entangled with the planet. I mean being able to see ourselves through time. I'm not talking about the boundaryness of humans. I'm talking about the full entanglements of our reality, breaking through the objecthood of being human. What I want to say to you is that this is a lovely conversation and we have about 2 years to fix it. I'm kind of not joking. That's the timescale where you see the disruption of humans as labor. And in that disruption, we will see the social contract and violence run away with itself. So if there are capital holders sitting here, I think you have about 2 years to do something meaningful. After which the world will be formed through war and crisis. The labor collapse is already happening as meaning has been eviscerated from the theory of contribution of labor. And you're seeing it already in the cultural form, I would argue. I think we are going to have to work. I'm no longer convinced there's going to be some great leader who will come up there and say, this is the way we're going to do it. So we're going to have to dance with crisis. And the crisis will make us more open to some of these realities, and it'll make us more vulnerable. And we're going to have to dance this way through. But this is the moment for large-scale cultural innovation and investment that we've never seen before. Because I think the crisis is not air source heat pumps, windmills, turbines, all the things we talk about. Those are just fixes at the edge of the story. And why I suppose I'm delighted to be here and honored to be here is I actually think that is the existential question. Everything else, we're in conversations about how do you cool the Arctic or how do you support 1% of the global's biodiversity put into trust. Big questions, important questions. But I think the real question is this. Those are all symptoms where the crisis is manifested. The question for me is what does it mean to be human and how do we reimagine it very radically, very structurally? And I think that is really in your hands as some of the best people I know. So with that, I'll thank you.